thank you for joining me for this, your daily intelligence briefing for September 28th, 2021. This is the video series coming to you from Protestia, where we try to sum up the biggest headlines in Christian polemics and discernment news in 10 minutes or less. I don't think I've hit 10 minutes now in multiple videos, and this one's not going to hit 10 minutes because I feel like I need to play catch up here a little bit. I've been missing out on some headlines lately, and we have a roster of dummies. That's what I'm calling it, a roster of dummies for this video. I guess I could say a roster of apostates, a roster of heretics. You'll get the point as we get into some of that bad news. First, the good news before we get into it, the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you do not know what the gospel is, this is what it is. Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, the Son of God, sent by the Father to the world, born of a virgin, to live the life that we could not live, the perfect life we could not live, die a death on the cross vicariously in our place, to make payment to the Father for the sins of you and me and anyone else who would believe in him. That's the good news. And why is that good news? Well, because the bad news is that none of us are good enough. None of us are without sin, and being with sin makes us guilty before the Father, before God himself, and worthy of eternal punishment and separation from him. But Jesus, in the most loving act ever known to mankind, died to pay the penalty for that sin and secure for himself a people, children of God, adopted by the Father, those of us that believe in Jesus Christ. Jesus now sitting, first of all, he died, of course, on the cross and suffered that pain and punishment and shame in our place, was raised on the third day, and now sits at the right hand of the Father, interceding on our behalf with him. That's the good news of the gospel. If you have any questions about that, please reach out to us on any social media channel so we can answer questions, tell you more about Jesus, or just pray for you. Now on to the headlines here. Like I said, it's a roster of dummies for tonight. This first headline from Protestia.com, James Coates, who is, of course, a pastor in Canada, said, TGC author, Gospel Coalition author, this is a Canadian author, of course, sounds more like Judas than he does Mary. And this, of course, is Paul Carter, who, if you've been listening to Polemics Report for some time, we talked about Paul Carter months and months ago. He is, let's put it this way, Paul Carter's a coward. He's a cowardly man that does not understand the purpose of the church and continues to say stupid things like, when Christians appear more focused on their rights and liberties than their service and sacrifice, they have lost their sense of the beautiful tune. Sounds kind of stupid because it is stupid. He fails to make the point that when you stand up for your rights, your God-given rights, the way that God created you and the things he gave you because of your birth, because you're created in his image and a human being, when you stand up for those rights, you also stand up for those rights in others. So it's a false dilemma, false dichotomy to say that people focusing on their rights, their individual liberties, is somehow different than them loving their neighbor. It is loving their neighbor, because again, when you stand up for your rights, you stand up for the rights of everybody else too. And when you give them away, you give away the rights of everybody else too. It's not that hard to figure out, but for a coward like Paul Carter, it really is. He said in this other tweet, what a disaster. This was a major topic of discussion in Premier Ford's press conference today. Oh yeah, bow before your government official, Paul. Whatever this was supposed to accomplish, it has failed. More than failed, it has backfired. Loudly, publicly, embarrassingly failed. Please reconsider. And what is he asking to reconsider? Trinity Bible Church deciding to open their doors, deciding to submit to Jesus Christ and his instructions versus the government. So this is, James Coates in Canada talking about the faithful sacrifices that Trinity Baptist has endured and explaining how Paul Carter is acting like Judas rather than our example, Mary. So there's a link in the Protestia article to James Coates' words on this and some text quotes you can go to see. Check that out at Protestia.com. Our next title here from Protestia as well. I didn't realize that Percy Noble was still around, honestly. But the title of this is Disgraced Megachurch Pastor Percy Noble releases a song, I'm sure that's great, mocking trolls. They're full of bleep. Former Megachurch pastor Percy Noble has released a song on Facebook mocking as trolls anyone who disagrees with him, describing them as living in their mom's basement and being obsessed with him because they have no life. I don't know if anybody could argue that anybody's been obsessed with Percy Noble. Like, seriously, I didn't think he was anywhere. I did not realize that he, and I guess I should have, in the mold of a lot of other failed and disgraced megachurch pastors, started one right back up in the way of Mark Driscoll. And I mean, there have been a lot of megachurch pastors that fall into serious disgrace and they sort of go into hiding for a little bit and then they pop out somewhere else. And Percy Noble did this. Last we heard of him was 2016. But he popped back out, after New Spring Church, which had 32,000 people listening to his drivel every week. After he fell into sexual sin, as far as I remember, he kind of went away and then came back with a church, not ironically called Second Chance Church, I think it's called. But anyway, so I guess he's on Facebook, social media, talking about all the haters are just obsessed with me. They can't think about anything other than Percy Noble while they sit in their basement and play World of Warcraft. It's ridiculous. Come on, man. No, nobody believes that. This actually sort of reminds me of, you remember it was a few years ago, Stephen Furtick, the Elevation Church, put out some like spoken word quasi rap thing where he talked about the haters and how terrible the haters are. They just hate me all the time. And this is the same kind of self-aggrandizing, look at me nonsense from these megachurch pastors that we've seen and will continue to see for quite some time, I suspect. Our next headline from Protestia: Dwight Mckissick, and we called him prominent, I don't know about that, but Dwight Mckissick, a prominent SBC pastor, is shocked that Democrats are pro-abortion after he voted for them. This was posted at Protestia a couple days ago. Like I said, we're playing a little bit of catch-up. Some of you may have already read these articles, but I'm going to go through it a little bit with my snarky commentary. Dwight Mckissick tweets out 4 days ago, it looks like, he tweets out, "Beyond heartbreaking, it's a tremendous amount of betrayal and disrespect for all of the minority evangelical believers who vote for Democrats because they are better at justice issues, safety net, police brutality, public school funding, anti-prisons for profit, immigration issues." Okay, where to start with this train wreck of nonsense? Evangelical believers who vote for Democrats because they're better at justice issues? Really, dude. So the party that supports baby murder is the party of justice to Dwight Mckissick. This is idiotic. It's not just idiotic, it's evil. To come onto the issue from that angle, they're better at safety net. You know what a safety net is? The safety net is the government taking money from one group and giving it to another. Taking from a group that earned it, giving it to another group that didn't earn it. You know, we call it charity, but here's the problem with government charity, ladies and gentlemen. When you use the mechanism of the government to take one group and give it to another, where do you think the glory goes? Part of the reason that Christians are encouraged to take care of the poor, take care of their material needs, is because we point them to Christ. We say, hey, this is just a little example of the greater love that Jesus offers you. That's why we want to take care of you, not just simply to give you some food and some clothes. We want to share the real gift, which is Jesus. But Dwight Mckissick apparently thinks that it's okay to support a party that uses government as the mechanism for charity. Guess where the glory goes when the government gives it away for you? To the government. That's why Democrats love it. They take your money, give it to people, and pat themselves on the back and say, vote for me, I'll give you more money. The glory goes nowhere near God. It goes to the state. It goes to the government. Now, next he says, Democrats are better on police brutality. Really? So you're saying that Republicans aren't in favor of the rule of law when it comes to police enforcement? Yes, we certainly are. Public school funding, yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, honestly, public school funding. But let's start with it this way. Schools were originally formed primarily to teach doctrine, to teach the Bible, to teach the ways of the Lord. Do they teach that in public schools, Dwight? No, but public schools are certainly important to you. You know, God forbid that a kid goes to a school where Jesus is exalted and the Bible is taught as the ultimate authority and source of truth. You know, we gotta worry about the party that's better on public school funding. And immigration issues, yeah, that, again, a whole nother one. Anti-prisons for profit. We could keep going on and on. But suffice it to say, Dwight Mckissick being surprised that the Democrats turn around and passed some sort of attempt to codify abortion up until birth. And he's heartbroken by this. You're heartbroken because you're a moron. You're just stupid. That's all I can say about it. If you don't realize that the party of baby murder was going to support baby murder, I don't know what to tell you. This is just, I keep saying stupid. Stupidity can be a sin. Stupidity can be evil, and I think that's what we're seeing in this case. He tries to characterize it more. I definitely agree that Republicans are most hypocritical, duplicitous, and undeserving of claiming high moral ground because of the inconsistencies you raised and toleration of Trump's racism. Really, this is just embarrassing. I find the Democrats' endorsement of abortion on demand also objectionable. Since when, Dwight? Since when, buddy? Since when have you ever found it objectionable? No, you turned around and voted for him and encouraged others to do it. You have no moral credibility here whatsoever. You're not qualified for the pulpit, not qualified to be a pastor. You're working for the other team. You're a wolf in sheep's clothing. And everybody knows it. Our next headline, before I get too hot and bothered by Dwight Mckissick there. Documentary Sin Proof released features charismatics giving, quote, evidence of, quote, supernatural, quote, healing. The scare quotes are important here because it's not going to be evidence, it's not going to be supernatural, and it's not going to be healing. By the way, while we're looking at this, has anybody else thought that Bill Johnson looks a little bit like Fred Armisen, like an older version of Fred Armisen from Saturday Night Live? Maybe that's just me, but he's always reminded me of Fred Armisen, and it makes sense because the guy's a joke. Bill Johnson looks a little bit like him, but apparently there's a movie coming out and the description of the movie for Send Proof, which includes Hillsong's Brian Houston, I guess before he goes to prison, it's going to include him. Sean Bolt, Heidi Baker, Randy Clark. Collectively, these men and women have not healed a single person on account of their atrocious heresies in theology, yet the video purports to show them as the best evidence for healers that Christendom has to offer. Well, that's true. I mean, in terms of their supernatural, insane, quote unquote, faith healing, they probably are the best examples because they're the best at fooling people with it. So this is Elijah Stevens is the guy's name. His former pastor leaves the faith and he finds his own worldview falling apart. By the way, if your worldview is dependent on your pastor's morality, you need to be spending more time in Scripture because as much as we love our pastors and as much as they're a gift from God and generally wonderful servants for the Lord, they're still men. They can still fall into sin. And God help you if your worldview is dependent on the morality of that man because he can fall just like anybody else, unfortunately. Anyway, I digress. So safe to say we're probably not going to be watching Sin Proof, but head over to the website if you want to see more information. And if one of you decides to drop $15 and watch it and has some information for us about it that might be worth us watching it, please let me know. Far be it from me to not blow $15 on a movie full of heretics and things. That's kind of what we do around here, is study that kind of stuff. Next headline coming from Capstone Report. Pastors and SBTS at Southern Baptist Theological Seminary professors call for Ed Litton to resign. It's about time we're hearing this. The leadership, and this isn't from everybody, of course, but hopefully it starts the floodgates. The leadership of Kenwood Baptist Church, which includes Dr. Jim Hamilton, Dr. Kenny Burke, called on Ed Litton to resign as president. The call for Litton to resign came in a letter to the congregation delivered via email Thursday. And they said, "We believe that Dr. Litton would do well to resign voluntarily. His credibility as a leader and a preacher has been too compromised for him to continue. He may choose to muddle through the next convention or two, but we believe that would be a mistake. He should resign." I agree. The tradition, as far as I understand it, in the Southern Baptist Convention is for presidents to basically serve 2 terms, 2 years. I guess there's an opening for another vote for every year, but the tradition is basically to just kind of voice vote the guy in. We'll see what happens. But head over to Capstone Report to read this article talking about Southern Baptist Theological Seminary professors and members of the Southern Baptist Convention, Kenwood Baptist Church, and others calling for Ed Litton to resign. It's over at capstonereport.com. Our next article here coming from Reformation Charlotte, this talking about, I believe Jordan likes to call him Beardy McGoatface or something. I'm not sure. Ed Stetzer, who hasn't found a church trend or theological bandwagon he didn't want to jump on, is now, of course, jumped on the anti-racist bandwagon. Ed Stetzer publishing an article at USA Today, you know, of all of the places to make sure that your Christian beliefs will be understood and exalted. He goes to USA Today to publish this article called, what is it called here? When will Christians learn from the unending engagement cycle of evangelicalism and race? Probably, Ed, when you correctly characterize the Bible's teaching on race, which is that there's one race, a human race. There's certainly ethnicities, but there's one human race. And there are two distinguishers that the Bible talks about. That's the race of Adam and the race of, the race of Adam, those born of Adam and those born of Christ. That's what the Bible talks about. So the primary way that we interpret interpersonal relationships, especially society-wide, is who is of Christ and who is not. It's not a matter of who is what ethnicity or who has what cultural tradition. But, of course, Ed Stetzer loves to fall right into the trap, and he falls into it again. Or he's probably fallen into it quite a while ago, but he's giving us the evidence here in this article. The poll quote from this I find very interesting. There he is. And first of all, I want to point this out real quick. This is something that especially these college professors, these guys love to do. They love to credential themselves. Like, that at the end of this says Ed Stetzer, opinion contributor. At the end of the article, it's going to say what he does, where he's from, what his job is. But he can't help but talk about himself right at the beginning. As the executive director of the Wheaton College Billy Graham Center, it's one of my joys leading people through our museum. He has to say this, even though later in the article it's going to say that he's a dean and professor, in the picture there. Or, of course, at the bottom of the article, where it's going to say, go all the way down, and there it is. Ed Stetzer is a dean and professor at Wheaton College and the editor-in-chief of Outreach Magazine. So he's got his credentials here at the bottom, which is typical in an article, but like self-focused, narcissistic types, and I would argue that Stetzer fits that to a T. He says at the beginning, as the executive director, just so you know, I have credentials here, everybody. Just so you know. So you know that when I say things, that you take them more seriously than your average keyboard jockey, because after all, I am the executive director. So Stetzer goes on here to talk specifically about, some systemic racism and being anti-racism, which is a trap word for Marxism, by the way. But he says here, talking about Josh McDowell and McDowell's, I suppose I would argue, incomplete or out of context or potentially inappropriate statements earlier that he apologized for. Stetzer reminds us that the murder of George Floyd last year by a Minneapolis police officer did more to ignite the conversation around systemic racism in America and in the evangelical movement than anything else in my lifetime. Suddenly, many evangelicals who had avoided issues of race were asking questions and looking for leaders to speak out. Is that true? Many evangelicals who had avoided issues of race? Let's rewind real quick on what happened with George Floyd. Because whether you want to say that Derek Chauvin murdered him or you want to say that the drugs did most of that, which is what I would argue, whichever way you want to say it, there was no evidence that it was because of his race. Just let's put that out on the table, Ed, because you seem to be forgetting about this. It couldn't be because the guy resisted arrest or had committed a crime, and so the officers had probable cause to detain him. It couldn't have been that he was high as a kite. No. None of that had to do with it. It had to be race. It had to be race. There has to be a reason for white evangelicals like myself to feel guilty about race, and here it is. He says, the way this temptation reinforces and exacerbates the cycle within evangelical circles crystallized for me when several leading African-American pastors in Chicago invited me, Ed Stetzer, to join them for a Faith Leaders March in the Bronzeville neighborhood. A Faith Leaders March. Right. To claim that George Floyd's death was about racism, even though it wasn't. Even though there's no actual evidence of that. Forget about evidence. That's not important, right, Ed? It doesn't matter if you can actually demonstrate that racism had anything to do with it. There's too much, politicking to be done. All right? There's too much influence for would-be Marxists here to push critical race theory and social justice into the church, and you're just a willing stooge to go along, aren't you?
They invited me to join them for a faith leaders march. Following Floyd's death, we marched and prayed for racial justice and for an end to the riots impacting the very neighborhood. Walking alongside these friends and partners in ministry, yes, here's the virtue signal. My aim was to simply be present in the midst of what was their event. Yeah, it couldn't be your, I mean, you can't stand up against racism unless you have some black friends with you, apparently, right, Ed? My aim was to simply be present in the midst of what was their event as they spoke up against racial injustice and the riots that had impacted their communities. Well, why did the riots impact their communities? Perhaps because the media lied about what this was all about? Perhaps because politicians and Black Lives Matter leaders decided that this was their chance to take advantage of people's emotions? This was a chance to not let a crisis go to waste? Yeah, you can go read this article if you want to. Over at Reformation Charlotte, they put it, talk about it pretty extensively here with just a terrific analysis. I would recommend you head over there to read it at Reformation Charlotte. And again, stay tuned to protestia.com. Click subscribe for this channel and click that notification bell to get notified of all of the videos that get released, even sometimes when one of our guys puts a video up there that doesn't really belong, that I have to move. But anyway, thank you for joining us again for this edition of the Daily Intelligence Briefing for September 28th. We will see you again next time.